Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. In my role as an art advisor, I've always enjoyed visiting art fairs, from local ones to the megas like Art Basel. And over the last several years, it's been fascinating to see not only how many fairs now take place annually, but also how central they become to the gallery business model. Of course, fairs aren't always the best way to experience art, but they remain an important venue for discovery, networking, and for galleries, the business development opportunity of meeting new clients. That said, fairs have often been called a necessary evil, and there have been ongoing calls to just rethink how they operate and to reduce the industry's reliance on them. Until now, much of this conversation has been anecdotal. And that's why I was particularly interested to read the 2025 Art Fair Report, which was recently released by First Thursday, a new collector intelligence platform. So in this week's episode of the podcast, we dive deeper into some of the report's findings with First Thursday's founder, Callum Hale-Thomson. The report offers important insights into how galleries are approaching art fairs today and what the future might hold for this part of the art market. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Thanks so much for listening. Callum, thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I really enjoyed the report and digging into some of the findings here. But before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about your startup, First Thursday, and how did this survey come together? And what was the approach like in terms of actually gathering all this data?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as you mentioned, First Thursday, we're an art technology startup, and we build a platform for commercial art galleries that really helps them to better understand their collectors and ultimately to drive more sales. We do this by helping them to collect really critical information about new collectors when they meet them, and then also cross-check that information and research extra insights from public sources, their own databases, also they can have a more complete picture of their background, their interests. Now, how the report came together, well, a core principle of First Thursday, right from the very beginning, has been that we're really trying to build technology that's used on the ground by teams. It's designed to really cut away a lot of that manual admin and those sorts of tasks. And so when I started this business, the first thing I did actually was spent 6 months basically hunkering down on the floors of art galleries, mostly in London, where we're originally based. And I spent a lot of time examining how teams were running sales processes, how they were running art fair processes, and also how they were interacting with technology. And as part of this research, I was doing dozens and dozens of interviews. A topic that came up, unsurprisingly, again and again was art fairs, how they were becoming an even more significant part of gallery business, how potentially risky but also rewarding they can be, and how galleries can really make the most of them on a day-to-day basis. And through all these conversations, I felt like I was having all of these really similar, insightful chats with gallery owners. But then when I took a step back and I looked at public reporting, at media, or lots of the discussions happening on art world panels, felt like there was a bit of a disconnect. And so I thought there was a great opportunity to actually go and bring a lot of these voices together. And I think hopefully encourage a discussion about where fairs really go from here. The fair came out over the last kind of 6 to 9 months from interviews, from surveys, sometimes online via Zoom, sometimes in galleries, sometimes on the floor of the many art fairs I was at. And a really big focus throughout all of this really was to provide a space for those voices to shine through rather than just a pure quantitative focus that I think many reports go for.
Yeah, and I really liked in the report that it included data and findings from your survey from the galleries, as well as direct quotes from different galleries about the different elements of art fairs. And so in the report, you mentioned that most galleries feel that the current status quo when it comes to art fairs just can't be sustained. This might seem like somewhat of an obvious question, but what is the status quo when it comes to art fairs? And how did we end up here?
Yeah, I think it's something I've been thinking about a lot in the recent weeks and months. I mean, I kind of want to start by saying I do think that the basic principle of art fairs and having lots of them makes a ton of sense, right? If you're a London gallery in a super competitive market in a key city, the idea of like popping up your business in New York for a week when all the world's best collectors are there, like, makes a lot of sense. And I think when there were a handful of like key global fairs that were really established, this allowed galleries above a certain level to gradually expand their footprint, their client base, and be a bit more international while still having that foothold in their home market. The status quo, well, we've come quite far from that, I think. So if you fast forward to today, we now have hundreds of art fairs each year. I've seen estimates of 300, 400 annually. And also, they now cater to every different segment of gallery, right? So if you're a blue chip gallery, you're going to be at Basel or Frieze. If you're an emerging art gallery, there's also this plethora of suitable fairs for you that are going on about the same time. And I think the key attribute of these fairs, in addition to their volume and how frequently they show up, is really how expensive they can be for these galleries. We spoke to a lot of galleries across a wide range of sizes, and in average, they attended 4.4 per year. Some attending as many as 20, and some only a couple. And over half of them are spending over $40,000 just to do a single fair. And that's not including all of the other things that are associated with attending, right? So shipping and insurance, having your staff travel in some cases across the world, putting them up in accommodation, and all of the additional materials that you have to put together to do an art fair really well. And then on top of that, the opportunity cost of spending that time thinking about that fair, in some cases spending weeks or months of preparation. I mean, it's all a huge strain on teams. And so I think we're at this interesting moment where fairs have got to a certain cost point. There's enough of them that it's an incredibly competitive space to be a gallery, where people are starting to really question whether it's worth it anymore, or if there are certain ways in which we should act differently. And I think the best actually example for this was recently I was in New York in May for Art Week, and had probably a less intense experience than he did. But I saw Tim Schneider's article from the Grey Market about doing 12 art fairs in 74 hours. I think he called it an out-of-body experience. And I think that for me was the real, I guess, talisman of where we are today. That there are so many fairs going on at the same times. There are so many opportunities for galleries to display. And I think the numbers still just aren't quite adding up.
And so as an art advisor myself, when I visit fairs, I often chat with galleries, not only about the art that's actually in their booths, but also about how sales are going at the fair and really just gauging their general view of the market at that particular time. What I haven't really discussed with them in depth, and I don't think many do, is their actual return on investment at an art fair. And that's why I found it so interesting that your survey actually asked galleries directly about the profitability of participating in art fairs. From your findings, it seems most agree that the ROI is pretty weak right now. Do you think that's mainly due to rising costs of participating in fairs, slower sales, a combination of both, or something else even?
Well, I guess the super factor here really feels like we've got a system that's basically emerged and grown through boom years, right? Fairs that are ever growing their footprint globally, multiplying in numbers, in some cases increasing in cost as well. And so it feels like we have this model probably that's designed for an industry that is growing year on year, whereas we all know that we're currently in a bit of a tricky spot, and we're actually in an industry that's shrinking in some ways. And I think this is causing trouble across a lot of different areas. But I think ultimately it comes down to the equation a gallery is making between, I think, those 2 points, right? The huge costs that fall on the gallery, regardless of whether they perform in terms of sales. And I think both of those together are causing a bit of a pincer moment. I think there's a secondary piece here for me, which is I think there's a lot of maybe shaky math going on sometimes in gallery sales rooms as well. In a lot of the interviews I did, I'd often hear things like galleries saying, we spent, say, $50,000 all in and we sold 100,000. So we're even after our 50% take. But understandably, that's not really an accurate way of putting it. Even if on a dollar basis, you're even. I think galleries aren't always thinking about the huge cost of sale that you actually have through participating in the fair, and then the opportunity cost of selling that piece to that collector at the fair versus selling back home. And these are all really tricky things to quantify. But this is why we were so interested in asking this question about how do galleries perceive that return on investment? Because interestingly, I thought, considering the frustrations we heard in some quarters about cost and about sales, we got quite a middling response from galleries in terms of how they felt about the actual ROI. It wasn't as dire as it could have been. And so I think, we're still in this tricky spot where everyone's trying to assess and figure out what they measure and how they measure it so they can fully have a picture of what that ROI really looks like.
And so despite the lower ROI, at least at the moment, many galleries are still doing several art fairs. From your conversations with galleries, What is the main priority and motivation to be doing fairs at the moment? Is it about business development, meeting collectors, curators, advisors? Is it about sales, or are there other factors?
Yeah, so I think there are two big factors and then maybe a third silent one that I'll kind of go through. I think on a very practical basis, yes, fairs are still, a great way to go and build your buyer base, cultivate those collector communities and new markets, and really focus on, exposure to new audiences. We found that over seven out of 10 of the galleries we spoke to said that exposure to new audiences was the most important reason for attending. It was actually the highest or the most selected option in our study. Interestingly, direct sales was slightly below that. So that came in not that much below, but just under 6 out of 10. And this was quite interesting for me because it showed a bit of a maturation in how galleries are thinking about, again, that ROI figure or the incentive for attending fairs. I imagine during much more boom years, you might expect to, you hear stories of the sellout booths and fairs putting out incredible stats about how much revenue is generated for their partner galleries during those fairs. And I think we're definitely seeing a shift now where galleries are starting to think, okay, maybe my return is not going to come directly from, dollar sales on the booth and immediate acquisitions, but from tapping into and nurturing those audiences over a longer period of time. Because although maybe the amount of money people are spending at fairs might be reducing, the quality of people who are showing up probably isn't. So that feels pretty meaningful still. But in addition to, I guess business development in terms of relationship building and direct sales, I think a lot of galleries still do attend fairs probably out of a reputational drive. It can be so difficult to make the leap into those higher tiers of fairs, right? I hear so many galleries trying to get into Frieze here in London, or into other established or more prestigious fairs. And I think once you're there, the idea of stepping back can be, very concerning to a lot of galleries. So I think a lot of people do the circuit also for potentially, I guess, emotional over commercial reasons as well. And that's something that until it gets really bad, I think we'll continue to see.
And so you also highlight in the report that some galleries, at least, are rethinking their fair strategies. Is this a recent development, and what kind of changes are you seeing in how they approach fairs, or at least considering approaching fairs moving forward?
Yes, I mean, I actually was looking back in some articles from 2015 to 2018 about galleries' perceptions of fairs, and a lot of these topics aren't new, right? There's always been specific galleries who talk about the cost challenges or the ROI difficulties, or even in some cases the volume of fairs, right? We have more now than ever before, but even a decade ago there was still a very significant global circuit. From many of the galleries I spoke with, the main, I guess, push was, unless they were a gallery who was really trying to be ascendant in the industry and trying to break through into that kind of established mid-tier or blue chip space, a lot of galleries were being a lot stricter about how they decide on which fairs they attend and basically where they play their chips. And I think with that brings a lot less experimentation, right? If there's a new fair opening up in a new market, galleries might be less inclined to actually go and attend that. And I think we've seen that even with a number of fairs who've decided to not go ahead this year in some secondary markets as well. Probably, I would imagine, as a result of feedback from those galleries as well. So I think, we're mostly seeing, I would say, a shrinkage in the number of fairs that galleries are attending, but it's still early days in terms of people really pulling back, I'd say.
And so really the big question moving forward about art fairs is, if the current model isn't working, what kind of alternative ideas or solutions are galleries putting forward that could make the art fair system more sustainable?
Well, this for me was actually one of the most positive areas of this research, was that obviously there are frustrations and concerns about, I guess, the status quo. And there is this general sense that things need to be reviewed and changed for galleries to be able to continue to participate. But the amount of, I guess, the number of suggestions and recommendations we received, I think, was very exciting. And I think the other side of it was very clear, again, even from galleries who found the costs or the sales performance challenging, it was very clear that the fairs aren't going anywhere, right? And I think, for the record, I think that's a very good thing. I think what we are starting to see is more alternative options for both operating inside and outside of that fair system. And we're seeing these crop up for galleries because they're starting to think more about that general sense of how do they grow their exposure and collector bases without having to purely rely on these singular channels like fairs. So, inside the fair model, we've already seen some positive movement, especially on booth prices. I've seen, especially for smaller galleries. I know Art Basel's been doing this for 6 to 7 years now, basically, trying to help subsidize smaller galleries in participation fees. And, this has also been a longer term conversation, but we're starting to hear this topic around alternative pricing models for fairs coming up too. For example, tying a gallery's booth rental fee to actually the total value of the works brought, or trying to think of a way of, I guess, balancing the financial return and sales value a gallery gets from a fair with the cost that they pay to participate, which, to me makes a ton of sense. If you're going to go to a fair and do half the sales you did last year, is it really fair that you pay the same booth fee? I'm not sure if there's a clear answer there. And I also think one of the insights we got from the report was a lot of galleries were frustrated that they felt in order to make the numbers work and hit that kind of golden ROI figure, they had to bring presentations that were maybe less interesting or more commercial to be able to make the numbers work at a fair. And so thinking about models that incentivize both players, right? Incentivize galleries to bring the most daring, exciting presentations of work, and the fairs to, in many ways, take on some of the risk that galleries are facing in these downturn moments. That's something that was spoken about a lot. Another thing I've seen a lot of, especially in Europe, but I think I saw quite a few especially at Independent this year, was galleries sharing booths to try and balance out that cost. And again, thinking about how galleries can still continue to have that global footprint without maybe the pressure of doing it entirely on your own, and the risk of having that kind of negative ROI. Outside the fairs, I think there's a lot going on, which I'm quite excited about. In the last few years, we've seen some new models of fair develop that are less structured to your, I guess, traditional booth conference center model. I'm thinking of fairs like Minor Attractions in London that takes place during Frieze. I was at Mega in Milan this year during Me Art, which is brilliant. And Esther, they had their second edition in New York during Art Week in May. And these fairs are much more about bringing a smaller number of works, presenting them in a curatorially very interesting way, and bringing in a much lower entry point for galleries. In some cases, I know of galleries paying a tenth of what they'd be paying for a major art fair to participate in one of these smaller fairs. But I think from a collector and gallery engagement perspective, I think really thinking through how we can continue to present internationally and bring works to new markets is going to be super key. And I think I've also seen galleries starting to think about, can they follow the, I guess, art fair trends without actually participating in the fairs? So can you do pop-ups in cities during art fair weeks? I know Angelica Joplin at Incubator popped up Incubator in Chinatown in New York during Frieze this week and did 2 brilliant back-to-back shows, and I think did pretty well off the back of it. So there are alternate models that are probably not as costly and challenging as the fair system that I think are going to start to crop up. But I think it's ultimately positive because what I'm seeing is galleries are starting to really think through where are they finding new people and how much is it costing them. And I think instead of just having to rely purely on a single channel, which can be very risky, that idea of diversifying, I think, is super important.
Well, Callum, we really appreciate you coming onto the podcast and chatting more about some of your key findings from your Art Fair Report 2025. If our listeners haven't read it yet, I definitely recommend they do. What's the website they can visit to download the report as well as learn more about First Thursday?
Absolutely. So if you head to first-thursday.com, there's a link right in the top of our homepage that will take you straight to the report. And plenty more information about the business there as well. So would love to hear any feedback and thoughts as well, straight back to me.
Perfect. Thanks so much again, Callum. Speak soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.